Is it even possible to identify morphic resonance, something that can or cannot be seen depending on your perspective? Certainly something that is important to any person who wonders why they behave the way they do or do the things that they do. There's a lot of information in this podcast, so please feel free to get hold of me if you want to discuss any of my perspectives. Thank you. Has anybody heard of a thing called Morphic Resonance? Nobody ever heard of it. Just as a side note, this little piece of paper, I hope everybody had a chance to read it. It's out of John Milton's Paradise Lost. It's not any special part of the poem. It's just the part of the poem that I'm reading at the moment. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. I thought it was very interesting. This is a very, very long poem. 280 pages. One poem. So, anyways. Now, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about with Morphic Resonance is there's a lot of scientific information around this stuff, but it sounds like really flaky. Morphic resonance, when people talk about morphic resonance, they're talking about a kind of a cosmic memory. An energy field that exists just outside of our consciousness, just outside of our awareness. When I listen to people talk who are atheists who believe in the whole Big Bang theory, what they believe, what they're saying that the science shows is that when the explosion happened, that there are molecules that have aligned in a particular way that cause this phenomena to happen, and that under certain conditions they can be measured and seen. That's what part of the reason for the Higgs boson experiment was, that in a perfect vacuum, is it possible to bombard particles at each other and create, in essence, something out of nothing. Now, there's one small little problem with that theory, with that way of thinking. That way of thinking says that everything in the universe, all matter, is unconscious matter. So like this cupboard or this chair, it's an inanimate object. Everything in the universe is inanimate. And the only reason that we are present or conscious is because of a collection of inanimate substances are creating consciousness, which then in itself is also an inanimate experience. And that's what part of hard science is saying. There is no God, there is no nothing. We're all just chemical. Everything is just a chemical reaction to what is taking place. And there's a belief system, and it's a belief system that's come a long way. And I believe that it plays both sides of the coin. It plays into whether there is more to life than just inanimacy, or if everything is just this inanimate experience. And they pinpoint where the thinking changed around the 17th century, around the scientific revolution, where people started looking at measuring things and the way things measure up, and can we quantify, can we prove what it is that we're seeing. That the universe is governed by laws. That there are universal laws that are in place. Which is why I'm saying that it can play both sides of the fence. Is that people with a belief in a God can then say that then God is the universal law enforcer. That's who God is. God enforces the laws of the universe. If you don't believe in God, that there are these mechanical systems that are functioning, whether we like them or not, they are not conscious, they are not aware, they are just hard matter, like a grinder that is operating, and that is something that we can measure, or that we should be aspiring to try and measure. I have one little concern around that, in the way that I perceive these things, is that in trying to quantify a God or a system, I believe that we lose out on the actual meaning of life, if I could say that, if I could say it that way. I'm quite possibly using a very ham-fisted way of describing things that are quite a delicate balance, where if okay, let me just leave it at that, because I don't want to get into too much jargon and too much of that kind of, too much language, or trying to box, which then would be the exact opposite of the exercise. What Morphic Resonance believes is, or what Morphic Resonance is trying to say, is that this is not a machine. That there is this mechanism that operates, and I don't even want to say, because they don't say it, that there's some intelligence behind it. You know, that's just me trying to explain it, saying that there's some kind of intelligence there. But I find it very hard to come to terms with the fact that it's rigid and immovable. I know that there are things, for every action there's an opposite and an equal reaction. That's just normal reasoning and rationale. But to draw those hard lines, I think is that's where it gets tricky. So they've done experiments. Obviously, the guys are trying to prove the scientific way of looking at these things. There are people who are also looking at what I'm talking about, which is the Morphic Resonance, which is this more kind of intangible effect. In the research, it's always the poor rats and mice that get sacrificed for all of this research. In the research, what they did was they had these mice find their way out of a maze, and over a period of years, it took 220 mice, a group of 220 mice, to figure out that if they take this left turn on the maze, that they could get out of the maze. a while later, I don't remember the exact amount of time, a while later, it came down to 180 rats could figure out which turn to take in the maze. And they started doing these experiments in different places in the world. And they found that the mice were doing exactly the same, well, not exactly the same, but with intolerances were behaving the same in different places. That there is this kind of universal memory that is, and then it went down to 120 mice, being able to figure out the left turn on the maze. Because it seems to be the one thing that, I don't know, manages to evade the system a little bit. There's a very famous experiment that they did with gorillas, chimpanzees, monkeys. They had them in a cage, and there was a ladder going up into up the cage. And if one of the monkeys ever went up the cage, they'd electrocute the floor of the cage. So then it became like the ideal of the group to make sure that a monkey didn't go up the ladder, because everybody would be electrocuted. And as they ran this experiment, when they stopped doing the electric shocks in the cage, the monkeys still wouldn't let other monkeys go up the ladder of the cage. Now, they've done the same thing with mice with smells, that if there's a specific smell that takes place. Now, these are changes that take place that have got nothing to do with DNA. They've looked at the DNA and they've tested the DNA. There's no correlation to these kind of experiments with DNA, where for 2 or 3 generations those rats will be afraid of that same smell. They'll panic. So a similar example in humans is if somebody is petrified, not afraid, terrified of snakes or spiders or something like that. I think the most common example would be, why are children afraid of the dark? But if we look at, was there something somewhere in history where someone was bitten by a snake or bitten by a spider and died or had a bad reaction, which has transferred this memory on somehow without words being spoken or any of that kind of stuff? It's cosmic memory. Part of the experiments that they've done as well is, and I thought this was very interesting, is with dogs and cats. Whether a dog would know when its owner is coming home, or whether a cat would know that the owner is coming home. And they did 1,000 of these experiments to see what would happen. But the owner coming home at different times, in a different car, wearing different clothes, and have proved again and again and again that the dog is able to sense or be aware of when their owner is coming back. Cats as well. Now there was something else that he mentioned. There's just something that I thought about in terms of experimenting on animals, on mice. Mice are notorious escape artists, as are rabbits, and it would be in anybody's best interests to breed that kind of behavior out of mice, a passivity, so that we could just do our experiments without worrying about these lab animals running riot all over the place and becoming Planet of the Apes, where we get wiped out. And then we do our experimentations on these kind of animals, and then those products get passed down to us. And how much of an impact does that have on us as humans? Does that have any impact? The response that lab animals have to what is happening to them, does it have an impact, or does it resonate somehow on us? Are we getting some of our characteristics trained out of us as a result of that kind of stuff? That's just my thinking. I don't know if it fits in or if it doesn't fit in. But what they looked at as well, and one of the examples that they cited as well with regards to this cosmic memory morphic resonance, is IQ tests with humans. They've been doing the same IQ tests for years and years and years and years. And IQs have been going up. It seems people are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And specifically with that example, it can be such a grey area, because are we as a society getting smarter or not? So let's say in the last 50 years we've been using the same IQ tests to test people's intelligence, and everything that I've heard about IQ tests is that IQ tests are a very, very good way of testing someone's intelligence. I certainly have no idea what's in an IQ test. 2 people, 3 people. Yeah, I've no idea what is in an... Anyways, it's just another example of where they cite that human behavior in different places changes together. Another example in line with the dogs and cats is if you're thinking about somebody and they fight. So now, if you're talking to someone who says that everything is inanimate, there is no consciousness. When we talk about what we're talking about now, which is, for lack of a better word to describe it, mental telepathy, right? They're going to say that you are a lunatic. I don't watch paranormal episodes on TV because I think it's a load of rubbish. I think the scientific term that they use for this kind of thinking is woo-woo, which I find quite amusing. Now, in contrast to morphic resonance is DNA. And DNA is something that we talk a lot about here in the treatment center. We say that the disease of addiction is genetic. The markers for the predisposition to alcoholism have been identified. I've spoken myself personally to a paleontologist who has claimed, I think I've spoken to 2 paleontologists, 2 blood scientists, who claim that they have been able to identify the alcoholic gene, and they have done the research and they can pinpoint it. And just a little bit of history, just to put DNA into perspective. DNA is not a new idea. If you again go back as far as the 1700s, where they were breeding sheep to grow long hair and perhaps to be more hardy, to have a more hardy breed of sheep, as a boom to the economy. This is what people were thinking about. When you look at animals, dogs, breeding dogs for specific things, that's manipulating DNA, working with genetics. This is something that people have been thinking about for a very, very long time. I was just overseas I was in Italy, and something that I noticed that was quite interesting. Everybody always talks about the Mediterranean diet and how wonderful the Mediterranean diet is. And the Mediterranean diet is the same as our diet, but with a few differences. So we eat the same tomatoes, we eat the same pork, beef, cheese, bread, butter. The food is the same. But when you go to the supermarket to buy tomatoes, you don't get these perfect, rosy, that you could measure, picture perfect tomatoes. They look like they've been grown next to a nuclear power plant. You know, they're all out of shape. All the tomatoes are like that. You go and buy tomatoes and they look funny. The bread, if you buy bread, you'll have to have toast the next day. So like here, you buy Cisco Wonder Bread. That Cisco Wonder Bread is going to stay fresh for a week and a half. There, you eat the bread the day that you buy it. They make bread every day because it goes dry the very next day because there's no additives in it, there's no preservatives in it, there's no chemicals in it. The fruit and the vegetables are coming out of the ground the way that they're supposed to come out of the ground. I'm not saying exclusively but to a large degree, the meat is grown without antibiotics and without being corn-fed, which is what I understand what a huge problem with beef is that the cows like it and it's tasty, but they need grass. They need to be in a pasture eating grass for their digestive systems so that they can be healthy. And we're giving them mealies. So this is a little bit of a sidetrack there. So there's an interesting dynamic when it comes to DNA. Let me see if I can pull this back on track a little bit confused there. They say that they can predict a person's height genetically using a tape measure with 80% accuracy. 80% accuracy based on your family DNA. If they have to use the scientific method of going into your genomes and looking at trying to pinpoint that way how high you are going to be, 5% accuracy. I didn't realize that there was such a huge discrepancy about what's happening in DNA and how little they know about DNA and what it does. Apparently there are 50 markers that get used in identifying height, just in height, and everybody knows that there are thousands of these things. It's possible to identify through DNA some illnesses, apparently cystic fibrosis, but for the majority of diseases you can't predict who is going to get sick and who is not going to get sick using DNA. What it does work very well for is heritage. So to see if I wanted to see where my people come from, which I'd like to believe all come from Italy, but undoubtedly not. That's what DNA is very handy for. So it comes down then to things like, everybody knows who Beethoven is, one of the greatest musicians of our time. And I don't know if you're aware of it, I'm aware of it, that Beethoven came out of a very musical family. His sisters, his father, and if I'm not mistaken, a few generations of his family were all musicians, which is which happens with these very musical people. not necessarily the rule. I don't have any musicians in my family, and I can play the guitar. My grandmother used to play the piano. There's an argument there for, well, then you have the piano in the house. You have the musical, Beethoven's family, they're all playing the violin and the harpsichord and the those kind of things. Obviously, he just slotted into it. A blacksmith, son becomes a blacksmith, whose son becomes a blacksmith. You can say, with all the tools and the availability of that kind of stuff there. Does it have anything, the ability to learn and what we do and where our interests lie and what happens to us? How much of this has to do with morphic resonance? And how much has to do with DNA? In the movies, in our films, I'm going to use the example of Star Wars. You've heard this already, so bear with me. I'm going to use the analogy of Star Wars. If we take out, everybody knows Star Wars, Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, right? We're all on the same page with that. If we take out the drama, because a lot of what is in Star Wars is drama to create more of an impact. So the Empire, which is run by the Emperor, whose main goon is Darth Vader on the one side, and then we've got the rebellion on the other side. Princess Leia, Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, all of those guys. I was thinking about this because I was thinking about all of this. We've got all of this DNA evidence, and DNA really is a science. There's a lot of work being done on DNA. Currently, the work that they're doing on DNA with the technology called CRISPR is DNA splicing, where they can edit your genes. So I don't know what characteristics they're hoping to change, or even what the significance of that is going to be. Certainly causes concern, because if we start breeding people. Now, everybody knows about Dolly the sheep, which is the sheep that was grown in a laboratory, and there was a moratorium that was put down that there will be none of that cloning business going on. But if we start editing DNA to make our children smarter, faster, quicker, what else can be bred out of humans? That we become more passive, that we become more docile. How do we know if somebody's going to be doing that to us? I'm sure everybody here is aware that there's no Google in China. China has their own search engines. And the reason that China has their own search engines is because they don't want anybody Googling Winnie the Pooh. Right? Winnie the Pooh is how they mock their current dictator, who has taken over communist China because he has a plan that he's busy implementing. So we have the communists and the way that they're doing things and the way that they're censoring things, and they are extremely successful and they are extremely prosperous, and they have moved into Tibet. And I was just getting onto my whole political rant and I got derailed. The Dalai Lama is not allowed to visit South Africa because of our ties here in South Africa with the Chinese government, and the Chinese government does not recognize the Dalai Lama, which to me and Bishop Tutu, and I'm sure some of us here think that is an awful thing. Irrespective the Chinese people seem to be doing quite well. And then Western civilization, which we are a part of, which we have inside knowledge of and inside biases and inside thinking about. Where maybe the way that we're going to be editing our DNA is going to be completely different to the way that they're going to be editing their DNA to improve life, to make life better, to have a better society for everybody. Because that's what the empire wanted, so that we can all just at last just have peace, with me in charge and as the dictator being the one who decides. Or the way that we do things in the rebellion, which is to do whatever the hell we want, however the hell we want, if we want, when we want, to whatever degree that we want, because we've got as much freedom as we want to do whatever the hell we like. Part of my argument is just a little thin argument in between all of these things is, and it was an argument we were having in the office, is that there's still going to be people who are just going and doing what they want anyway under hard systems, but can also just be a small fringe percentage, 10%, us, the fringe group who don't like to be told what to do and do whatever the hell we want, no matter what the system is. So we got these two sides of the coin. There's this Morphic Resonance. There's evidence, scientific evidence that has shown that this is a truth and this is a reality. Do we throw our lot in with this lot? There's hard science. Do we throw our lot in with this side? Which is better? Which one is the right one? Which is the right way to do things? And then in the middle of all of this, and it's a very corny analogy that I'm using. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep here. Then we have this analogy, which is it's such a feeble analogy of Master Yoda. Now, if you remember in Star Wars, Yoda didn't want Luke Skywalker to go back to the rebellion. He wanted him to finish his training. He wasn't interested in which side. He wasn't interested in the war that was taking place, because that was just the current war. This is a war that had been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. He'd been living in that swamp for however long because of the previous war. And this was just a continuation of the war between the left and the right, the conservatives and the liberals, the ones who want all the evidence and the hard structures, and the ones who want kind of the freedom and to go with intuition. And I want to have a look at this little thing that I passed you all here. Has everybody got it? Let me just read it quickly. Reading poetry is not my forte, so please just bear with me. Fallen cherub. To be weak is miserable. Doing or suffering. But out of this be sure, to do aught good never will be our task. And ought is an interesting word. Ought I do this or ought I do that? If you look at the dictionary definition of the word ought, it means no. To do no good, but he doesn't use no, will never be our task. But ever to do ill, our sole delight, as being the contrary to his high will whom we resist. If then his providence out of our evil seek to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end. and out of good still to find means of evil, which oftentimes may succeed, so as perhaps shall grieve him if I fail not, and disturb his innermost counsels from their destined aim. The poem is called Paradise Lost. I believe what he's saying there is he's saying that for some reason in all of us there is a darkness. And that's just how it is. We were made that way. And there's light, so the yin and the yang. And my struggle is the struggle for the light. Because my experience of the darkness is that it causes me pain. And my experience of light is that it gives me freedom. But I've been made in such a way that I'm continually in this struggle. It is part of me being human to have this take place. It will never not be part of me. And it's in the striving to move from darkness to light that I find enlightenment. Now I use the word enlightenment. It can perhaps be a little bit of a cliche, but the way that I understand it is to shine light on. To shine light. I don't know on what. To shine light. You know? So there's always going to be the struggle between using the metaphor of DNA and the measurement and trying to identify and quantify, and the metaphor of Morphic Resonance, which is these strange, bizarre, cosmic memories, undertows that are very hard to quantify, and that when we talk about, people think that we're mad. You know, moving between those two states to become awakened to real life. These things can be a lot to think about. And if life is really quite simple, the simplicity of it being to be present, to be conscious, as opposed to be unconsciously figuring out things that can't be perfectly quantified, as opposed to accepting, then we are not living in our life. Then we are living an unconscious life and being dictated to by forces that are not, that we are not aware of and are not conscious of. Okay. Cool. We leave it there. Any questions?